before the first kingdom marched to war, a quieter battle was already underway, one that is fought in a garden, in a throne room, and in the hidden chambers of the human hearts, where a single whisper could outweigh the very word of God. Indeed, empires of rebellion are not built in a day. They rise silently from a single entertained doubt, a single justified compromise, until a glittering tower of lies stands with pride in the same place where faith, trust, and partnership with God once stood. The stories of Queen Jezebel, King Saul, or King Solomon don't just serve as historical records of the people of God, they also act as cautionary tales of the patterns of spiritual warfare, with cognitive warfare at the front line. In order to move out of reactivity and into strategic responses to contemporary cognitive warfare operations in the world today, the people of God must go back into Scripture to trace the blueprint of this unique aspect of hybrid warfare and understand at the core the exploit of human vices by the same enemy of God through thousands of years. Standing against humanity on the battlefield of the mind is the city of spiritual rebellion, controlled by the serpent, with one of the central towers being the tower and fortress of cognitive warfare, built upon the foundation of deception, confusion, and ambiguity. This is Eden Evermore, and this is Incoming Impact. First cognitive warfare campaign in the Garden of Eden taught us that even the perfect human, free of blemishes, suffering, and sin, can still fall. But how did it happen for the first imperfect woman, Eve? And did Eve commit something else before disobedience? The whisper of temptation from the serpent in the ears of Eve didn't just carry venomous words of slander toward God's characters. They also carried beautiful promises that appealed to more than just the flesh. They were appealing spiritually. Moreover, while the slanders were covertly said or faintly implied, the false promises were deliberately emphasized to maximize the appearance of a positive trade-off. When we talk about the promise of the serpent in Genesis 3, it can be said that there were 4 things that the serpent tempted Eve with, both covertly and overtly. They were spiritual autonomy, godhood, or power equal to God, intelligence equal to God, and beauty. In other words, he was tempting her with a future where she would have the beauty, power, authority, and knowledge to act in the same way God does, but without God. These 4 things can also be understood as the 4 pillars of fundamental desires or promised gift of enlightenment. The same temptation had been used by the serpent time and time again to the children of God for thousands of years. You may have noticed how, in his words, the serpent didn't outright say anything about rebelling against God. What he did was more covert, starting with his lying about the consequence of eating the fruits, as well as implying that God was withholding Eve from her true potentials, thus slandering God's characters and sowing the seeds of confusion and doubts. The invitation of rebellion was sent not through narratives of direct and necessary cooperation with the serpent, but through seemingly logical and thoughtful words of encouragement, empathy, and persuasion. Oiling himself calmly around the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, The serpent made himself out to be a being who was more understanding of Eve than even God, someone more trustworthy than God, who not only empathized with Eve, but somehow also knew exactly what Eve supposedly needed. In isolating Eve from her husband Adam and God, the serpent aimed to reframe, reshape, and manipulate Eve's cognitive framework concerning God's promises, his characters, and even the characters and trustworthiness of her husband, all without speaking any overt directive of starting a coup. In this way, the serpent had arguably created a buffer environment of ambiguity in which he was supposed to be protected with deniability. It was a gray zone of decision making, meant to push Eve toward using her own free will for rebellion, a place where trusting in God and knowing Him personally was no longer enough, a place of lack where more was promised, but only possible through autonomy. The temptation, therefore, was for Eve to trust in herself instead of God. And so, before there was a sin of disobedience, there was a betrayal that was first made in the heart of mankind. Cognitive warfare operations and campaigns today can be built upon the same principles. Their outward appearances often carry a false promise of mental and spiritual enlightenment, while their content is meant to draw people away from the covenantal relationship with God and get them down on their knees through the orchestration of emotional manipulation. Successful cognitive warfare operations exploit the core of human vices, and they cloak themselves in symbols, languages, and images that point to harmlessness, goodness, security, integrity, authority, and neutrality. If cognitive warfare waged by the serpent was a tower, it has long been depicted in Genesis 11. The Tower of Babel was a symbol of pride, rebellion, ambition of spiritual autonomy, and the lust for power and spiritual dominance that challenged God and his authority. This tower is the prototype for the cognitive warfare model that the serpent is waging today, with the same message echoing through its hall and shouted at the rooftop. Did God really say? The foundation of the serpent's cognitive warfare tower is the same as it was first presented in the garden: lies. As in the case of Jezebel and her rise and reign in the spiritually compromised kingdom of King Ahab, the foundation of her cognitive warfare operations was also built on lies, reinforced consistently by the false majority of the 450 prophets of Baal, who were trained and fed by Jezebel to espouse and repeat this information into the ears of King Ahab and Israel. By doing this, Jezebel successfully created a fertile ground for sustainable spiritual adultery and the voluntary betrayal of Israel toward the one true living God, Yahweh. Before the betrayal could happen, however, Jezebel knew that she had to reframe and reshape the minds of the people around the God of Israel. She had to build a reputation for her false gods, Baal and Asherah, in the hearts of the king of Israel, and convince the people that her false gods were as equally powerful and trustworthy as the one true living God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. From the outside looking in, this was a hard task to do. What was in Jezebel's advantage, however, was that the heart of King Ahab was already adulterous and hardened against his creator, proven through his willingness to do evil in the sight of the Lord by marrying her and bowed down to her request of building altars to her false gods. Notice the same pattern of rebellion through self reliance and self determination found in the garden. Eve decided for herself that the rewards promised by the serpent was worth the risk of betraying God. The same could be said about King Ahab. The rewards of his autonomous decision in marrying Jezebel and going against God's will to him was somehow justified. And this is how the serpent continues to build his empire of rebellion higher and higher with every compromise that humans make every day in the war of the mind. At the front line of this empire stands multiple towers of rebellion, represents the serpent's arsenals against God and his people. Among them is the Tower of Cognitive Warfare, one of the most critical and ancient fortresses of spiritual offense. There are strategic layers to the serpent's tower of cognitive warfare, and at the top, the most visible part of the tower, the crowning diamond, being the most seductive part of the tower that is glistening with pride, stands the four fundamental pillars of desires: spiritual autonomy, competitive power and authority, intelligence, and beauty. Cradled in the center of the city of spiritual rebellion is the flag of challenge that the serpent hoisted at the first coup, with the word I engraved on it. This is the most visible and attractive part of the tower for several reasons. First and foremost, it strives to be an overwhelming force that embodies the things described by Apostle John in 1 John 2, verse 16. For everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life comes not from the Father, but from the world. In doing this, the summit of the tower aims to trigger the flesh to respond according to 1 John 2, verse 15. If anyone loves the world, love for the Father is not in them. Going down the tower from this summit, we will explore the layers of human desires, cognitive biases, and vices that the serpent aims to exploit through specific and targeted cognitive warfare campaigns and operations. These factors are all deeply interconnected, and the purpose of the cognitive warfare operations are to trigger their conduciveness and interdependence of one another to create chain reactions of emotional spiraling. This means the emotions are triggered in a way that ensure they will always operate together and reinforce each other to form a cohesive web of multifaceted cognitive manipulation processes that work to infiltrate, penetrate, and ultimately dominate the target in an overwhelming fashion from top to bottom, inside out, causing the target to undergo a gradual, often painless, undetected, and voluntary process of internal collapse. So let's start by going down to the fourth quadrant, which is the layer right below the summit. Here we have the most surface level of human desires and vices. In the same manner as the summit, these human desires and vices cloak themselves in beautiful and spiritually appealing symbols and languages that connect them directly back to the four fundamental pillars of desires. They are meant to further justify the mental and spiritual compromises through human free will and represent the greater good or the trade offs of such compromises in the same way that the summit does, but more covertly. In the real world, they can be comfort and security, which is the replacement of spiritual and authentic joy and enlightenment, temporal happiness and instant gratification, and earthly pleasures at the expense of a meaningful relationship with God. And triggering the willingness of humankind to pursue these things in order to reach the ultimate promises at the summit, the serpent tries to gain access to its target's more foundational vices at the deeper levels of the human psyche. If the serpent fails to appeal to the desires and trigger the vices at this level, he will have more difficulties pushing for the next level of spiritual compromise needed to facilitate the internal collapse of his victims. Therefore, the temptation at this level has to be carefully crafted so that it speaks to the person's heart in a way that doesn't suggest outright spiritual rebellion and betrayal against God, which models what happened in the garden. Namely, the serpent did not coerce Eve into leading a rebellious army against God. He simply nudged her into a place where she was convinced to lean on her understanding more than she trusted God. And so, more often than not, the cognitive warfare operations and campaigns at this level are crafted in the form of distraction from the faith, deconstruction from the faith, disruptions to the direct communication line of devotion and worship of God, and gradual disconnection from the faith, often through layers of delusion and the desensitization of sin, or the glorification of the sin culture. Together, they work toward the justification of sin to achieve the greater good. An example of this level would be the rebellion of King Saul in 1 Samuel 13. During his war against the Philistines, King Saul made a chain of not only strategic failures that fomented an atmosphere of suffocating pressure on his psyche, he also overstepped his spiritual authority under the pretense of achieving or protecting the greater good for Israel, which was a combination of factors, including dignity and the reputation of military sovereignty. Specifically in 1 Samuel 13, verses 3 to 4, Saul had a trumpet blown throughout the land and said, "Let the Hebrews hear." So all Israel heard the news. Saul has attacked the Philistine outpost, and now Israel has become obnoxious to the Philistines, and the people were summoned to join Saul at Gilgal. Herein lies a contrast with the subtlety of military operation from the time of Joshua, specifically in the Battle of Ai in Joshua 8. Instead of the calculated approach of an ambush, like what Joshua orchestrated according to the instructions of God, Saul went ahead of the prophet Samuel to not only summon the people of Israel to Gilgal to witness a supposed performance of military might, but he also failed to heed the instructions of God through Samuel to wait on God. 1 Samuel 13, verses 8 to 9, he waited 7 days, the time set by Samuel. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and Saul's men began to scatter. So he said, "Bring me the burnt offering and the fellowship offerings." And Saul offered up the burnt offering. Just as he finished making the offering, Samuel arrived, and Saul went out to greet him. At this point, instead of feeling remorseful and sad for his grave sin against God, Saul did what Adam and Eve did in the garden, shifting the blame on Samuel and on God himself. In verses 11-12, Samuel asked, "What have you done?" Saul replied, When I saw that the men were scattering and that you did not come at the set time, and that the Philistines were assembling at Michmash, I thought, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the Lord's favor. So I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering. And so instead of waiting until Samuel arrived at Gilgal to begin the ceremony of the burnt offering and the fellowship offerings to the Lord, King Saul caved to the temptation of carrying out the ceremony himself. This decision became a direct violation of spiritual offerings, which was only meant to be done by the anointed mediator, prophet, and judge Samuel. The greater good, as in the case of King Saul, could be perceived as the security and the victory of the army of Israel against the Philistines under his leadership. In trying to protect this greater good, Saul committed a spiritual crime at a level his flesh could never completely fathom. And that was all it took for an anointed person of God to fall. In the next episode, we're going to explore the rest of the tower, containing all the deeper layers of human vices that the serpent continuously exploits to the fullest in order to ensure the internal collapse of its targets. Understanding the anatomy of the serpent's tower of cognitive warfare is important because it allows us to come out of reactive mode against the many modern campaigns and operations waged by the Dragon of Revelation, to step back and look at the battlegrounds of cognitive warfare more holistically, starting from the basics, which in turn empowers us to trace and recognize the interactive map of emotional manipulation that the Revelation Dragon is actively using in contemporary warfare to attack Christianity and penetrate the minds of the people of God.